The Shadow in the Napalm, Chapter 1. The Road of Fire and Blood. The year was 1967. The jungles of Vietnam were alive with the rhythm of war. High above the sky was never silent. The thunder of B-52s and fighter jets echoed like angry gods. Below, in the thick green arteries of the Truong Son mountains, the Vietnamese soldiers marched carrying rifles, sacks of rice crates of ammunition, and an unbreakable will. For the Americans, this road was the enemy's lifeline. They called it the Ho Chi Minh Trail. To the Vietnamese, it was the road of survival, a road of unity, a road soaked with blood and sacrifice. In Washington, generals demanded results. Cut the trail, starve the North, burn the jungle if you must. And so came the decision, napalm. It was no ordinary fire. Napalm clung to everything it touched: skin, earth, metal. It burned not for seconds, but for minutes, suffocating, melting, erasing. It was meant to break the body and the spirit. But in the deep forests of Truong Son, the spirit would prove untouchable. A company of young Vietnamese soldiers moved silently along the trail that night. Their boots were worn, some walked barefoot, but their eyes gleamed with purpose. Among them was a boy no older than 19, his rifle longer than his arm, his shoulders bent beneath the weight of rice sacks. Ahead walked the political officer, a man with a sharp jaw and tired eyes, whispering encouragement. "Remember, comrades, each grain of rice we carry is a bullet for the South. Each step we take is a step closer to freedom." They smiled, though their lips were cracked, though their bellies were empty. They sang quietly under their breath, a song of rivers and home of mothers waiting far away. High above, unseen American pilots fixed their coordinates. In their cockpits, they armed the silver cylinders strapped beneath the wings. Napalm. Tonight, the jungle itself would burn. The order came. Engines roared. The first bombs fell tumbling like steel raindrops. When they burst open, the forest ignited in a roar of liquid fire. It spread faster than water, clinging to trees, to leaves, to skin. Men screamed as flames swallowed them whole. The night turned red. One soldier threw himself onto a crate of rice, shielding it with his body. Chapter 2. The Night of Fire. The jungle was never truly silent, but that night it trembled with an unnatural tension. Crickets had stopped, their endless chirping birds had fled, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In the darkness, the company of Vietnamese soldiers marched slowly, their silhouettes blending into the dense foliage. They carried their burdens with grim determination, bags of rice that cut into their shoulders, boxes of ammunition heavy enough to make their knees shake. Still, no one complained. They knew the value of every grain, every bullet. Above them, a faint metallic hum whispered through the night sky. It grew louder until it became a roar. The men froze. Heads turned skyward, though the canopy concealed the heavens. They knew that sound. Jets. The officer at the front hissed a command. "Disperse, stay low." They scattered into the undergrowth, pressing themselves flat against the damp earth. The young soldier of 19 clutched his rifle to his chest, his heart hammering like a drum. He whispered a prayer for his mother, and then for his country. High above, American pilots received the green light. Their orders were clear: annihilate everything in the zone. Scorch the jungle, break the backbone of the supply line. Their hands moved mechanically, almost detached, as they released the silver canisters. They had done this many times before. Some told themselves it was just another mission. Others muttered that it was necessary to save lives later. None of them thought about the faces hidden below the trees. The canisters fell whistling through the air. They struck the ground with a hollow thud and burst open, vomiting liquid fire. Within seconds, the jungle became an inferno. Napalm splashed across trees and rocks, sticking to bark, leaves, and flesh alike. The flames spread hungrily, faster than water leaping from one tree to another. Night vanished, replaced by a searing dawn of red and orange. Screams tore through the air. A man staggered from the underbrush, his clothes aflame, his body writhing as the fire clung to his skin. He tried to roll on the ground, but the flames only spread, feeding on the oxygen. His cry turned into a gurgling moan before he collapsed, a charred silhouette on the earth. Another soldier, his back ablaze, hurled himself against a crate of rice. He covered it with his burning body, protecting it from destruction until his voice gave out and his form stilled. Others tried to dig into the soil with their bare hands, desperate to bury the precious food and ammunition. They shouted, coughed, cried out to one another, yet through the agony, their voices carried the same refrain: "Do not let the supplies burn. Protect the road." The 19-year-old clutched his rifle, even as his sleeve caught fire. He tore the burning cloth away with his bare hands, skin blistering. Beside him, the political officer dragged a wounded comrade out of the flames, his face blackened with soot and blood. He shouted, "Keep moving! If we die, the road must live." Around them, the jungle itself seemed to scream. Trees exploded as their sap-boiled branches rained down in burning shards. Animals shrieked in terror, their bodies turned to ash before they could flee. The earth itself bubbled and split beneath the relentless assault of fire. But still, amid the horror, there was defiance. Men with flames on their bodies refused to drop their burdens until the very end. Some staggered deeper into the inferno to rescue comrades, knowing they would never return. They sang fragments of old folk songs, their voices breaking, yet unyielding, as though daring the flames to silence them. When at last the planes disappeared into the distance, the fire remained. It burned through the night, a sea of molten light that consumed everything it touched. The company was shattered, many had fallen. Their bodies reduced to smoldering forms, their shadows etched permanently into the rocks and soil. But survivors still rose, coughing, limping eyes, burning not with smoke, but with determination. They lifted what supplies they could salvage and pressed forward into the darkness beyond the flames. For them, death was not an end, it was a sacrifice. The road had to live no matter the cost. The next morning, American infantry moved into the zone to survey the destruction. They expected silence corpses, nothing but ash. What they found instead were shadows burned into the earth itself, black silhouettes of men mid-stride, rifles on their shoulders, frozen in eternal motion. On boulders, the outlines of hands stretched out, as if reaching for life. On tree trunks, the shapes of bodies bent low, as if still carrying their loads. The soldiers shivered despite the heat. One muttered, "It's like they're still here." Another crossed himself quickly, his face pale. The officer barked at them to move on, but even he avoided looking too closely at the dark imprints. They were not simply stains, they were testimonies, ghosts branded by fire. That night, as the Americans set up camp amid the scorched remains, unease crept into their ranks. The jungle was silent, but not empty. Men swore they heard footsteps in the ash boots crunching in rhythm. Others whispered of voices, Vietnamese words carried on the wind, too faint to understand, but too close to ignore. The youngest private woke screaming, claiming he saw a figure standing at the edge of the camp, its body blackened, eyes glowing like embers. The others laughed nervously, though none of them dared to look outside the circle of firelight. In the distance, the jungle glowed faintly, where embers still smoldered. And in those embers, shadows seemed to move steadfast, unbroken, marching forever down the road of fire and blood. Chapter 3. The shadows remain. Morning arrived with a gray haze that hung low over the scorched jungle. The once living canopy of Truong Son was now a skeletal wasteland of blackened trunks and smoking embers. The air stank of ash chemicals, and something worse burned flesh. American boots crunched over the brittle ground as the infantry unit advanced cautiously, rifles at the ready. They expected resistance ambush, perhaps snipers left behind. But the jungle was dead, and with it everything seemed silent. One soldier kicked at the charred remains of a crate. It disintegrated into dust. Nearby, the outline of a man was imprinted against a boulder, arms raised, knees bent as though caught in the act of running. The silhouette was dark, burned into the very stone, as if the fire had stolen the man's body, but left his shadow behind. The soldier froze his throat dry. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "Look at this." Others gathered, staring in horrified silence. On another rock was the blackened outline of two men, one leaning on the other for support. On the ground lay the shape of hands reaching forward, fingers stretched as if clawing at the earth. Everywhere they turned, more shadows stared back, silent, frozen, eternal. "It's just carbon," their lieutenant muttered, though his voice was unsteady. "High heat burned them into the surface. That's all." But the men could not tear their eyes away. They had seen death before, but this was different. This was not the remains of bodies, it was the mark of their souls captured at the moment of sacrifice. As the sun climbed, the heat grew unbearable. The Americans set up camp among the ruins, though many muttered against it. The charred trees looked like twisted sentinels watching with hollow eyes. The ground itself seemed to radiate more than warmth. It radiated memory. The soldiers avoided stepping on the darker patches, though they could not explain why. That night, the jungle spoke again. It began with the sound of footsteps, faint, deliberate, marching in rhythm. The sentries raised their rifles, scanning the perimeter, but the sound came from all around, everywhere and nowhere. Boots on gravel, steady and countless, as though an invisible column of men was passing by. "Do you hear that?" whispered one private. His companion nodded, his face pale. "They're still here." A voice drifted through the smoke-laden air. It was low, guttural, not English. The words were indistinct, but the tone carried urgency, command unity. It was the language of the enemy, yet it stirred something in the listeners, something they could not name but instinctively feared. One soldier swore he saw figures at the edge of the firelight. Men in ragged uniforms, their outlines shimmering in the haze, rifles slung across their shoulders. He blinked and they were gone. But when he turned away, a faint glow caught his eye. Two red points burning like embers in the dark. Eyes. Watching. Panic spread like a contagion. One man fired into the trees, the crack of his rifle echoing like thunder. Others shouted, spinning their guns raised at shadows. The lieutenant cursed, ordering them to hold fire, but his words barely cut through the rising fear. In the chaos, another soldier collapsed, clutching his chest. His comrades rushed to him, and only to find his face twisted in silent terror, eyes staring wide at nothing. His heart had given out, though he was young and strong. The camp fell silent, the only sound the crackle of dying embers and the echo of phantom footsteps fading into the night. By morning, the unit was shaken, their nerves frayed. The lieutenant barked orders, insisting there was nothing supernatural, only nerves and exhaustion. But the men exchanged wary glances. They could feel it, the jungle was not empty. Something had remained after the fire, something that walked among them. They had unleashed a weapon meant to erase life, but instead, it had branded the forest with defiance. One private muttered as he packed his gear, "They didn't die. They're still marching, and now they march with the fire." No one corrected him. Chapter 4. The Haunted Night. Darkness fell heavy upon the scorched jungle. The moon was a pale sliver veiled by drifting smoke that rose from the earth like the breath of the dead. The American camp lay uneasy, the men huddled close to their fires, as though the flames could hold back what lingered beyond. But fire was no comfort here. It was a reminder. It smelled of napalm, of bodies burned alive. Each flicker of flame cast shadows that seemed to move on their own. The soldiers had grown jumpy. Every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind sent rifles snapping to shoulders. They spoke in hushed tones as if raising their voices might attract unwanted attention. The memory of the silhouettes burned into rock and soil haunted them. The lieutenant tried to maintain control, but even he avoided looking into the darkness for too long. The first scream shattered the tense silence. A sentry at the northern edge of camp fired wildly into the trees, his voice breaking. "They're out there, they're coming!" Men rushed to his side, flashlights sweeping through the smoke. For a moment, nothing stirred, only the shifting haze and the skeletal trees. Then someone spotted it, a figure standing motionless among the blackened trunks. Its body was charred, its uniform tattered, a rifle slung across its shoulder. The face was nothing but blackened flesh, yet the eyes glowed faintly like coals in a dying fire. "Holy God," whispered one soldier. He squeezed the trigger. Bullets tore through the figure, but it did not fall. Instead, it took a step forward, slow and deliberate, its glowing eyes fixed on them. Then another figure appeared, and another, until a dozen forms emerged from the smoke, marching in silence. Panic erupted. The Americans fired in every direction, muzzle flashes lighting up their terrified faces. But the bullets passed harmlessly through the apparitions, who continued their steady advance. The night filled with the echoes of gunfire and the cries of men losing their grip on reason. One soldier fled into the jungle screaming. Moments later, his shriek was cut short, replaced by a sickening silence. When a search party found him at dawn, his body hung from a charred tree, his own rifle strap wrapped tightly around his neck. His eyes were still wide, staring at something unseen. Inside the camp, fear festered. Some men refused to sleep, their hands trembling on their weapons. Others broke down muttering prayers or clutching crucifixes until their knuckles turned white. A private confessed he could hear voices whispering in Vietnamese, repeating a single phrase over and over. When asked what it meant, he shook his head, tears in his eyes. "I don't know, but they sound determined." That night the marching returned, louder this time, closer. Boots striking the earth in perfect rhythm. The ground seemed to vibrate beneath the invisible column. The men covered their ears, but the sound was not in the air. It was inside their skulls, a relentless drumbeat of defiance. Suddenly, the political officer's voice, clear, commanding, rang out in the dark. They could not understand the words, but the tone carried authority, courage, and fire. The apparitions halted just beyond the firelight rifles at the ready. Their eyes blazed, and for a moment it felt as though the very jungle was alive with their presence. The lieutenant fell to his knees, clutching his head. "They won't stop," he gasped. "They'll never stop." By dawn, 2 more soldiers were dead, one from a self-inflicted gunshot. The other found lying cold, his face twisted in a mask of terror, though no wound marked his body. The survivors sat in silence, hollow-eyed, unable to explain what they had witnessed. The camp reeked of smoke, fear, and madness. The jungle had claimed its vengeance not through bullets, but through shadows and memory. The men had unleashed napalm to erase their enemy, yet now it was they who could not escape. The shadows of the burned marched still, relentless, eternal. And in the silence of the morning, carried on the smoky breeze, came the faint sound of a song, a Vietnamese marching tune sung by voices that no longer lived yet would never die. Chapter 5. The Road of Fire. The road through Truong Son stretched ahead like a scar carved into the earth, winding through mountains and valleys that now reeked of smoke. For the Americans, it was a target, an artery to be severed. For the Vietnamese, it was life itself, a promise carried on the backs of every soldier and porter who dared to walk it. The napalm had burned flesh, forest, and stone, but it had not burned the will of those who marched. By now, the American unit was unraveling. The lieutenant, once a man of sharp commands and rigid discipline, had grown hollow-eyed, his voice cracking when he barked orders. The men looked to him less and less, whispering among themselves about the shadows, about the whispers in the night. They had killed with fire, but the fire had not killed what it touched. It had only made the enemy stronger, eternal. The Vietnamese shadows haunted them still. At dusk, the outlines appeared again, etched into the horizon, walking the road with silent determination. Some carried rifles, others shouldered crates of rice, their steps perfectly in rhythm. The Americans opened fire more than once, but the figures never fell. When the smoke cleared, the road remained empty, yet the sound of marching lingered. Far to the east, in hidden tunnels and jungle camps, real soldiers of the North continued their work. Young men and women patched wounds, mended weapons, boiled rice. They knew comrades had been lost in the firestorm, yet they also knew the supplies had reached their destination. The road was alive. It always would be. And as long as one soldier could still march, the spirits of the fallen marched with him. One survivor of the napalm strike, his body scarred, but his spirit unbroken, whispered to his comrades as they prepared another convoy. They think the fire destroys us, but the fire only feeds us. Even in ashes we rise. Back in the American camp, discipline collapsed further. A private refused to patrol, swearing he could hear footsteps following him in broad daylight. Another woke screaming, clawing at his skin as though invisible flames clung to him. 2 men deserted during the night, vanishing into the jungle. Their bodies were never found. Some whispered the shadows had taken them. Others prayed they had made it back to base. But deep down, all of them knew they would never leave these mountains. The lieutenant wrote in his journal by lantern light, his handwriting shaking. We came here to cut the road, but the road cuts us instead. Every mile we walk, we sink deeper into their world. The jungle belongs to them. Even their dead belong to them. And now so do we. On the 3rd night, the Americans tried to sleep without fire. They huddled in darkness, desperate to hide from the glowing eyes that stalked the edges of the camp. But without fire, the night grew colder, the jungle louder. Some swore they could feel breath on their necks, the brush of unseen hands on their shoulders. One soldier felt lips at his ear whispering words in a language he could not understand, yet their meaning pierced his soul. You cannot win. At dawn, 3 more men were gone. Their packs and rifles remained, but their bodies had vanished. The road stretched on, waiting, uncaring. To the Americans, it was a curse. To the Vietnamese, it was a covenant. The jungle had witnessed fire and death, but still the road of Truong Son endured. And on that road, the shadows marched steadfast, unbroken, eternal. The napalm had given them form, and now they would never leave. Chapter 6. Echoes of the Fallen. The jungle did not sleep, and neither did the men who marched within it. For the Vietnamese soldiers who remained alive after the firestorm, each step along the Truong Son was heavy with loss, yet stronger for it. Every crate of rice lifted, every rifle carried, every song whispered beneath the canopy, carried not only the living, but the fallen too. The road was a grave, but it was also a lifeline. And those who had been burned by the napalm now seemed to walk with them unseen, yet felt a force of spirit that no fire could destroy. For the Americans, the opposite was true. Sleep became impossible. When their eyes closed, they saw faces blistered by flames, shadows reaching from the smoke. When they opened them, the jungle was filled with sounds that did not belong. Boots marching in unison, voices calling orders in a foreign tongue, the faint echo of songs carried by the wind. Each day blurred into the next, and the soldiers began to lose track of time itself. Was it morning or dusk? Was that sound a bird call, or the cry of the dead? One private began to speak to someone no one else could see. He sat cross-legged in the dirt, nodding, answering questions in whispers. When pressed, he said he was speaking to the burned man who stood just outside the camp each night. The others mocked him at first, until one evening he turned and screamed, pointing into the dark. They followed his gaze, and for the briefest moment, they all saw it, a figure blackened and smoking, its eyes glowing red, watching them silently. The mocking ended after that. Meanwhile, on the Vietnamese side, supply convoys pushed forward. Young women balanced baskets of food along winding trails while wounded men leaned on rifles, refusing to slow down. Every mile won was a victory. Every delivery completed was defiance carved into history. Though many had fallen to napalm, their comrades felt no despair, only resolve. A commander told his weary troops as they prepared to move again. The fire tried to erase us, but look, we still march. The road still breathes. As long as one of us walks, we all walk. The men and women nodded, some with tears in their eyes, some with grim smiles. And then, from the shadows of the forest, a faint chorus rose, unseen voices joining their song. The Vietnamese did not flinch. They welcomed it. For they knew their fallen had become more than memories. They were guardians now, forever tied to the road of fire. The Americans could not bear what they heard. The same song reached their ears at night, carried on the smoky breeze. But to them, it was no anthem of courage, it was a dirge, a reminder that their enemy would not die. The lyrics were foreign, but the emotion was clear: strength, sacrifice, endurance. The soldiers huddled tighter together, praying for silence, but the song always found them. A sergeant broke one night, firing his rifle into the dark until the magazine clicked empty. When the lieutenant tried to restrain him, the sergeant turned his weapon on his own, screaming that they were all already dead. By the time they disarmed him, 2 men were wounded, and the sergeant lay sobbing, begging the fire to stop burning his skin. But there was no fire, only memory. In a hidden bunker deep within the jungle, a Vietnamese political officer wrote in his journal, "They believe their fire frightens us, but their fire is only fuel. Our brothers and sisters walk beside us, though their bodies lie in ashes. The Americans do not understand, spirit cannot be burned." He closed the book, listening as the rumble of distant artillery echoed across the valley. Then he smiled faintly, for beneath that thunder, he could hear something stronger, the footsteps of the fallen marching still. By the end of the week, the American unit had lost half its men, not to combat, but to madness, fear, and the unseen. The survivors no longer spoke of victory. They spoke only of escape. Yet every path they took seemed to lead them back to the same scarred stretch of road, the same burned stones bearing the same blackened silhouettes. It was as though the jungle itself would not release them. And always, from just beyond the edge of sight, the shadows marched, steadfast, unbroken, eternal. Each step they took was an echo, and each echo was a reminder the fallen had not gone. They had only changed. And the Americans trapped in the road of fire could hear them still. Chapter 7. Into the abyss, the jungle closed around them like the walls of a tomb. The American soldiers no longer spoke of missions, objectives, or maps. All sense of command had dissolved. Even the lieutenant, once their anchor, now walked with his head bowed, muttering to himself as if reciting prayers. Their boots dragged through the mud, their rifles heavy in their hands. They were not marching forward anymore. They were simply wandering deeper, as if the forest itself was swallowing them whole. At night, the voices grew louder. No longer whispers, they were chants, cadences of Vietnamese songs rising from the earth, swelling through the trees. The Americans clutched their helmets, trying to drown out the sound, but it seeped into their skulls, vibrating in their bones. One soldier pressed his hands to his ears until blood streamed down, screaming for silence. When dawn broke, he was gone, leaving only his helmet resting upright, as though carefully placed by unseen hands. The others stared at it hollow-eyed. No one dared touch it. It was a marker, a warning the shadows had claimed another. Meanwhile, along the Truong Son, the Vietnamese marched. The living moved silently through the forest, eyes sharp, rifles steady, carrying supplies that meant life for those farther south. But they were never alone. At their side walked the shapes of comrades burned in the napalm strikes, blackened figures who carried the weight of memory and sacrifice. To the Vietnamese, these were not terrors. They were guardians. Where an American heard a haunting, a Vietnamese soldier heard encouragement, an oath renewed with each step. One young porter, no older than 17, stumbled under the weight of his basket. For a moment he faltered, but then he felt a hand on his shoulder, strong, steady. When he turned, no one was there. Yet he smiled, straightened his back, and kept walking. The road was long, but he was not walking it alone. The Americans, however, were walking into madness. The jungle around them seemed endless, the charred trees twisting into grotesque shapes. Sometimes they thought they saw villages through the smoke lanterns flickering in the night, but when they approached, there was nothing but ash. Other times they found themselves back at the same burned clearing, the silhouettes still etched into the stone. The circle repeated, and each time their fear grew sharper, their sanity thinner. One night, the lieutenant gathered what remained of his men. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands shaking. "They are not human," he rasped. "You've seen it. Bullets don't touch them. Fire made them, and now they live in it. We can't fight shadows." His men waited for him to say what they all dreaded. Finally, he whispered, "We are already dead." That night, the camp was surrounded, not by gunfire, not by enemies of flesh and blood, but by the steady drumbeat of boots. Dozens, hundreds, maybe more. The sound shook the ground, rattling their bones. Eyes glowed from the tree line, countless pairs burning like embers. The soldiers fired wildly, screaming the muzzle flashes, painting their faces with terror. But the shadows did not fall. They advanced in silence, their rifles raised, their burned faces locked in grim determination. One by one, the Americans broke. Some dropped their weapons and fled into the dark, never to be seen again. Others turned their rifles on themselves, preferring the quick certainty of death to the slow suffocation of fear. Those who remained watched as the shadows closed in step by step, until the firelight was filled with blackened figures that should not exist. The lieutenant stood among them, frozen. He dropped his rifle, raised his trembling hands, and whispered, "Forgive us." But the shadows gave no answer. They simply marched past him, through him vanishing into the jungle, as though he were nothing at all. When dawn came, he was found kneeling, his eyes vacant, his lips moving soundlessly. Whatever he had seen in the night had hollowed him out completely. The abyss had claimed them, not through battle, not through defeat on the field, but through the slow unraveling of spirit. The Americans had entered the Truong Son as soldiers. They remained as broken shells, their minds consumed by shadows they could not kill. And still, along the road of fire, the Vietnamese marched living and dead together, unstoppable, eternal. Chapter 8. The Last March. The mountains of Truong Son stood silent, their ridges shrouded in mist, their forests scarred by flame. Napalm had blackened the trees, but the road still cut its path through the jungle, stubborn and unbroken. It was a road carried on the shoulders of the living and guarded by the dead. By now, both enemies had come to understand that truth, though they saw it in very different ways. The last remnants of the American unit stumbled forward without direction. Their uniforms were ragged, their helmets dented, their eyes empty. The lieutenant, once a man of orders and conviction, was now little more than a husk. He no longer spoke of strategy or survival. He simply walked as though driven by an invisible hand deeper into the wilderness that had already claimed his men. Behind him, the survivors dragged their feet. Some carried rifles without ammunition. Others carried nothing at all, their hands trembling as if scorched by unseen flames. Each night, more of them vanished, leaving behind boots or helmets, arranged neatly as though placed by someone who wished to mark their passing. The men stopped questioning it. They only feared when their own turn would come. Meanwhile, the Vietnamese pressed onward. The convoys grew longer, the songs louder. New recruits joined the march, young, determined, carrying their lives on their backs. Every fire-scorched clearing, every burned silhouette, became a shrine to resilience. The road had become more than a supply route. It was a testament carved into history with sweat, blood, and shadow. A commander stood before his soldiers one evening, the firelight dancing across his scarred face. He raised his voice steady and strong. "They burned us, but they did not break us. The Truong Son still stands. The road still breathes. We are not alone, for our fallen march beside us." The soldiers responded not with cheers, but with silence, a silence filled with reverence, with unity. And then faintly, the echoes rose again, footsteps in the dark, steady and eternal. The Americans heard those footsteps too, but to them it was torment. They could not rest, could not breathe, with the sound ever pressing closer. Some swore the shadows no longer waited at the edges of camp. They walked openly among them now, their burned faces glowing in the dark, their rifles shouldered in silent defiance. No bullet could touch them. No fire could stop them. They marched on forever. One night, the lieutenant awoke to find himself surrounded. The shadows stood in a circle, their blackened bodies outlined by the moonlight, their eyes burning with quiet rage. Yet they did not strike. Instead, they marched past him, their boots pounding the earth like war drums. He fell to his knees, weeping, realizing what he had always refused to see. The fire had not destroyed his enemy, it had immortalized them. By dawn, the last of the Americans were gone. Some had fled into the jungle, never to return. Others had surrendered to despair, their minds shattered, their bodies left behind in silence. The lieutenant himself was found days later by a search team wandering aimlessly with an empty stare. He carried no weapon, no pack, only a notebook filled with frantic scrawls. The shadows march. They never stop. They never die. The Truong Son endured. Through napalm, through blood, through sacrifice, the road remained alive. The Vietnamese soldiers continued their march, the living shoulder to shoulder with the fallen, each step a defiance of fire itself. The shadows in the napalm had become legend, not just ghosts, but guardians. They walked forever in the smoke and mist, watching over the road, reminding all who passed that sacrifice does not end in death. It lives on eternal. And so, in the silence of the mountains, the last march continued, unbroken, unyielding, unstoppable. The fire had tried to erase them. Instead, it carved their shadows into history. Epilogue. The shadow becomes legend. Years passed, and the war itself faded into memory, but the fire of Truong Son never truly died. The jungle grew back, wrapping its green cloak over the blackened scars, yet beneath the roots and soil, the road remained whispering its story to all who dared to walk it. The echoes of boots, both of the living and the fallen, were said to linger long after the last shot was fired. Among American veterans, the tale of the shadows in the Napalm became a forbidden story. Few spoke of it aloud, and when they did, it was in hushed tones in bars late at night, their hands trembling around half-empty glasses. Some claimed it was madness, the fever of war. Others swore they still saw them in dreams, blackened figures with burning eyes, marching endlessly, always just beyond reach. To these men, Vietnam was not only a war they lost on the battlefield, it was a war that followed them home, haunting them with shadows that refused to fade. One lieutenant, old and broken, spent the rest of his life scribbling in notebooks. Neighbors called him mad. But when he died, his final entry was found written in a trembling hand. They are still walking. I can hear them at night. The shadows march forever. For the Vietnamese, the story lived in a different way. On the road of Truong Son, veterans told their children and grandchildren of those who had carried rice and rifles through firestorms, who had fallen but never truly left. They spoke of comrades who returned in the smoke, walking beside the living, guiding them through the darkness. These were not ghosts of fear, but spirits of honor, guardians of a nation's heartbeat. In small villages, mothers would point to the hills and tell their children, "Listen. Do you hear the footsteps? That is the sound of your fathers, your brothers, your sisters. They still walk so that we may live free." And when the children closed their eyes, they swore they could hear it, the steady rhythm of marching feet carried on the wind. The shadows became legend. To the Americans, they were a curse, a reminder of a war that seared their souls. To the Vietnamese, they were protectors, eternal companions on the road of sacrifice. Two sides of the same fire, bound forever by napalm's cruel light. But the truth was, the shadows never belonged to fear alone, nor to triumph alone. They belonged to memory itself. They were the proof that fire cannot erase spirit, that death cannot silence resolve. They were the shape of courage carved in smoke, carried forward by generations. And so the story endured, not in books, not in monuments, but in the heartbeat of the land itself, in every echo of a soldier's march, in every gust of wind that rustled the Truong Son canopy, in every flame that tried and failed to consume hope. The shadows in the napalm walked still, eternal, unyielding, immortal.